So I do research around undocumented communities in the United States, and I focus a lot in rural areas. And there's really been two questions that I've really been interested in answering related to informality issues. So the first question is really how the state actually creates informality. I think we've touched upon some of those themes in the session so far. And then the second question really relates to the vulnerabilities that are created when the state creates that type of informality. And so when you're studying undocumented communities in the context of the United States, I think those are two kind of critical questions that you really have to really engage. So today I'm going to present a case study of my work in Postville, Iowa. Okay, so Postville is a very small town. It's a rural town. It only has 2,000 people. Okay, so it's only 2,000 people, but it's a very fascinating town. This town is connected transnationally back to a village in Guatemala. So I'm really studying the transnational links between the small town, Postville, and then the sending communities in Guatemala. This site was also the site of one of the largest immigration raids in U.S. history. So in 2008, 400 undocumented immigrants were deported from Postville, Iowa. Okay? So that's kind of sets the context. Let's see if we can. So the undocumented issue is extremely important in the United States. About 8 million people in the U.S. are undocumented. And so there's potential for current comprehensive immigration reform probably this year. So all these 11 million people might have the potential of actually becoming legitimate. My argument is that undocumented immigration is not like this marginal kinds of labor. It's actually structurally a part of the capitalist system in the U.S. So I'm going to focus on what I call shadow transnationalism. So I'm identifying basically the hidden kind of informal networks that exist in these communities. So I'm going to discuss the recruitment networks that exist in these communities, the smuggling networks that exist in these communities, and the remittance networks that exist in these communities. And I think by understanding these very informal mechanisms, we're better able to understand vulnerabilities, interdependencies, and the context of what I'm terming shadow places. And I'll discuss what shadow places, what they mean. So I'm not going to get into all the literature on transnationalism, but I basically engage that transnational literature. And this piece has been very useful for conceptualizing some of the issues in undocumented communities, especially in the US. So this is Lurks. He's studied undocumented immigrants in the Netherlands. And he basically identifies what he terms shadow places. So he says that these conditions need to be present in undocumented communities so that those types of informal systems kind of take place and thrive. So the first one is transnational social networks. And basically the transnational social networks provide a social capital that gives immigrants the opportunity to mobilize different types of resources. Okay, so based on kinship networks, based on friendship networks, and so forth. The right labor conditions need to be present, and in the Postville case, you'll see how that was the driving force that brought a lot of undocumented immigrants to Postville. So abundant demand of low-skilled, intensive jobs with little regulation. So the little regulation is the key part here. Okay? And then the housing as well. So there needs to be accessible and inexpensive housing, again, with little regulation. So many times informal type of housing. Now this is the conceptual kind of model that I developed empirically from what I saw in the case study. Okay, so what I'm going to do is kind of walk you through this kind of grounded theory model that I developed, and then we're going to get into more of the empirical case. So on one side you see Postville. So this is the community in Iowa that I've been studying, and on the other side you see El Rosario. That's the community in Guatemala that I've also been studying. And the connections that emerge, the networks are recruitment networks, the smuggling networks, and lending and remittance networks. And when I get into more of the case, I'll give you examples of how this shadow transnational system existed. So the way to think about this is you have the state that actually provides the structure that creates the shadows. Okay? And the undocumented populations, they have to live amongst the shadows. And that puts them in very vulnerable types of situations. And in also situations where they could be easily kind of exploited. So for those of you that don't know where Iowa is, I'll talk a little bit about Iowa and what's going on there. So Iowa is basically in the center of the United States. It's an industrial agricultural state. Provides a lot of meat for not only the United States, but different parts of the world. And this shows the locations of the meatpacking plants in Iowa. And basically it's the meatpacking industry that's very dependent on undocumented labor that's driving the demographic changes in Iowa. So this is why you're getting a lot of Latino growth in the Midwest. This is a meatpacking plant in Perry, Iowa, and it really kind of shows the global nature of the labor force. Okay, they have different flags representing where the workers are basically from. Okay, so it's a global labor force. Most of it is undocumented. Now let's get into Postville a little bit. So this shows the percentage of Latino student enrollment in the Postville school district. And you can see why it's kind of very dramatic, the kinds of changes that are happening there. So just in a 15-year period, it basically went from actually 3 Guatemalans to over 800 Guatemalans by the time the raid kind of hit. Okay? Now this is again showing the percentage of students, right? So this doesn't show all the Guatemalans, but it's, when you're dealing with undocumented populations, it's kind of hard to get the quantitative data, but at least this kind of shows some of the changes, especially the impacts in schools. Okay, this shows the transnational connections that exist in some of the case studies that I studied. So you see at the end, this is Iowa, over here. So that's where Postville is located. And this is Mexico, and this is Guatemala. So Guatemala is south of Mexico. And the immigrants in Postville were directly connected to mostly one village in Guatemala. Okay? So the transnational connections and the networks are very, very localized, very kind of place-based, and very, very strong. So how did Postville become a shadow place? So the official motto of the town is hometown to the world. Okay, that's because it's a pretty multicultural town. So the meatpacking plant was actually a Jewish kosher meatpacking plant. So you have a large Jewish community, a large Jewish community, a large Mexican community, some Somalis, Guatemalans, and of course the American Anglo community, just in a town of 2,000 people. So the key thing to understand about this is really the demand really came from the meatpacking plant. Okay? So the demand at the meatpacking plant for low-wage labor, easily accessible housing, and linked transnational social capital from Guatemala helped Postville move steadily toward becoming a shadow town in the heart of the Midwest. A shadow place that was ripe with the conditions necessary to sustain a large number of undocumented immigrants. It was really the meatpacking plant that was the driving force of all these changes, all the cultural changes, economic changes in the town. And planners really understood the importance of the meatpacking plant. So one planner says, we benefit from the meatpacking plant, of course, via property taxes. They bring people to Postville. You've got people moving here that are employed at the plant, or drawing from the outside region, bringing people into your town to shop and so forth. So that's an asset that the city has. So the city really looks at the Latino community and looks at the plant in a kind of very beneficial way. So let's get into some of these networks. So the recruitment networks function all informally. The meatpacking plant really relied on the kingship networks and friendship networks of the Guatemalans. And in fact, they even advertised in Guatemala as well to bring in the villages, in the Guatemalan villages. So this is a quote from a Postville meatpacking worker. She says, "And then the Guatemalans came, and it started as a few, and they grew and grew. People would say, my uncle's coming because he needs work, and my brother's coming, and my sister-in-law's coming. And it was all word of mouth more than anything. People joked that there was a big sign in Guatemala that said, Postville this way." So you had the meatpacking plant needing the labor, and you had the planners and basically the city's civil structure really creating a welcoming environment for immigrants. And this is kind of unusual, okay, in the small rural towns in the U.S. There's a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment in towns, but this town really kind of understood the strong connection that it had to this labor force. So the town really saw immigrants as a resource that contributed to the local tax base and the rental market and so forth. They had cultural festivals. They created this nice multicultural milieu in the town. The Catholic Church had services for Latino immigrants. They had a multicultural radio station that broadcast in English, Spanish, and Hebrew and so forth. And the schools were really trying to be accommodating to the immigrants. The town also protected the unauthorized immigrants. So two town representatives, this was coming from a Guatemalan leader. He says, 2 town representatives approached me and said, I just want to tell you the following. You are safe here in Postville. That was the first time I had heard this. You have safety in Postville, but outside of Postville, you guys have no type of guarantee. So we had to know that there were certain rules we had to follow. It was like they gave us permission to come, but they would do with you whatever they wanted. So as they say in Postville, you have some guarantees, but outside you're on your own. Okay, so the local community, the local power structure in Postville really created a sense of a welcoming community and also kind of protected the undocumented immigrants. Okay, so the smuggling networks. Right? Smuggling networks were very interesting. They're again informal. They started from professional coyotes. Coyotes are people that smuggle immigrants from Mexico or Guatemala into the U.S. Okay, so they're these kind of criminal networks. And the trip would cost about $5,000, and that really morphed into more of an informal network that was based in the communities in Guatemala. Okay, so I call these like community coyotes, and those were based on kinship networks. So you had a couple of families in the villages in Guatemala that basically learned the routes to get into the U.S. and all the way to Postville, and then they made it into their own little business. Yeah, so that really was what was the driving force for getting a lot of the Guatemalans into Postville. They also had what I call formal prestadores, and these are people that lend money to the immigrants for their trip to Guatemala. Sometimes it was done through formal means, so Guatemalan banks actually got involved and they lend the money to the Guatemalans. Sometimes it was very informal from the community structure itself. So let's talk a little bit about what these communities are and some of the characteristics of them. So basically, they're highland Mayan communities. Okay, so these are up in the highlands. This is kind of a lot of, there's limited opportunities for them there. They used to be workers in a large plantation. They got displaced and they started their like informal settlement in Guatemala, and so they built their houses made out of sugar cane and so forth. Pretty basic types of housing. There's a lot of poverty. There's really not a lot of economic opportunities. So one can make the argument that in a way they're kind of forced migrants as well, because in terms of economic reasons. So you have the system of shadow kind of transnationalism in Postville. Okay? And this system is a very kind of unstable system, even though it was supported by the local state and the local community. There's a federal regulation that kind of came in and basically displaced the undocumented communities. So this was the largest immigration rate at the time. This was under the Bush administration, and he was had these large raids, and they deported 400 people. That had some pretty serious consequences in the town because the town was now very dependent on the shadow, the networks and transnationalism that occurred there. So Postville lost about 40% of their population. Housing market collapsed. The city was indebted to financing a wastewater treatment plant for the meatpacking plant. The meatpacking plant also basically lost all their labor, so they had to shut down. And the owners of the meatpacking plant actually were put in prison. The owner basically got a life sentence, 20-something years, not for immigration issues, but more related to financial fraud issues. And then the remittances, I estimate that they were sending about $50,000 a month to Guatemala, all stopped overnight. So you had the system that basically came tumbling down. So the remittances were very important to the Guatemalan community. They basically used these remittances to do, urban upgrading. They invested in their homes. They invested in getting building some community projects and so forth. And then the municipality that controls this little town started to do some more formal upgrading. So they built a bridge, they built some roads and improved the drainage system. They gave them title to their lands and so forth. Okay, so there was this kind of, I guess there was the formalization of the informal settlement there based on the remittances. So you see here, this is the orange building is a school. That was built with remittance money. The building in front of it is a health clinic that was also built with remittance money. And then there's a community center there. And the public space that you see there was built by the government. They wanted to kind of take advantage of the remittances that were there. Oh, perfect. So they started investing more in their homes and started doing some upgrading. All of this with about $50,000 that were being sent monthly from Postville. But once these transnational links were severed by the federal government's intervention, there was this dependency that was created in this community. Okay? And so basically everything kind of came to a halt as well. Okay? So in terms of housing, all the homes were basically half built. People became embedded, especially those that were dependent on the formal lending practices. They lost their land titles because that's what they had used as collateral. The systems that were informal, basically the people that would lend the money to family members and friends, those lenders kind of lost out because they weren't able to get any of the money back and so forth. And you had a shrunken economy. A lot of the local construction in the area and the small stores that were opening up, and basically the urban upgrading that was happening kind of stopped. And everything was kind of still. So now what people basically do is they're back to doing subsistence agriculture and cutting wood from the forest and selling it to their friends. But at the same time, there are some other kind of shadow networks that have arisen again in Postville, and this is a new Guatemalan community. So they're not directly coming from this community anymore, but now they're coming from other communities that are closer to the Mexican and Guatemalan border. Okay? So these networks are very strong, even with such a strong intervention. They're still able to kind of keep on living. So I think we could learn three things if we relate the literature on informality to transnationalism and how these shadow spaces are established. So one, we could gain a better understanding of how immigrants use informal mechanisms and networks to create shadow places. Okay? In many ways, it's this negotiating the personal networks and kinship networks to establish and kind of maneuver their new home communities. Okay? Secondly, we can expose the state's role in regulating shadow places via creating illegality and encouraging informality. Okay? So the state is really the mechanism that creates the shadows. And by creating this mechanism, it places these communities in a lot of vulnerability. So it creates vulnerabilities to maintain these populations in a subordinate position and disproportionately pushes the risks associated with this dangerous system onto the undocumented immigrants. So a lot of people lost out in Postville, but the ones that lost out, I guess, the most were the undocumented immigrants. Although the owner of the meat packing plant also got placed in prison. Facilitates the maintenance of an exploitable and vulnerable labor force. Okay, so undocumented workers in the U.S., I see them as the most marginalized kind of group of people in the U.S. because they're criminalized. They're not supposed to be there in the first place. And so once they cross the border or their visa expires, then they get placed in the shadow position. And it makes them very easy to exploit. It does not take the responsibilities of social welfare mechanisms into consideration. So the state can basically say, okay, we have this great labor force, but we don't have to really worry about the social mechanisms. So we don't have to worry about their retirement. We don't have to worry about providing them with any type of services. I mean, they do, but it's a little contested. But a lot of these immigrants, if they work in formal jobs, like in the meatpacking plant, they pay taxes as well. So they're directly contributing to the states, to the state, even though the state illegitimizes them. And the final thing, and this is really where I'm taking this research now, is I'm trying to identify the structure of opportunity that exists within these shadow places. So by structure of opportunity, I mean the agency that exists within the confinements of the structural constraints in a place, and how immigrants can use informality as a way to basically increase their agency. Okay? So as an example, how immigrants use invisibility as a way to kind of protect themselves and help link up to other informal mechanisms to increase their agency in their receiving communities. So I look forward to questions, especially if we can relate some of this work to what's happening in this region. I think that would be fantastic. Thank you.